Hi, so I'm Claire Downey. I'm the executive with the Community Resources Network, and I'm here to talk to you about our Green Enterprise project, delivering a service model for bulky item reuse. This project took place in 2018, 2019, and the network undertook the project because we really felt that we could help improve the flow of surplus goods into the reuse sector and maybe stimulate the conversation about reuse in the public sector. And it turned out to be particularly timely because due to COVID, there is an anticipated churn in office furniture as people reimagine the workspace. Our network supports social enterprises in reuse, repair, and recycling. And this project really started off because we were hearing about large clearances going to skip, being told about volumes of furniture going into the skip, particularly from the public service, and being asked what could be done about it. And some research in 2011 found that about 1.2 million potentially reusable bulky items, and I'll explain shortly what we mean by bulky items, were actually going to waste on the island of Ireland every year. And office furniture in particular is not usually thrown out because it stops working, but because there's some minor wear and tear or because it's just gone out of fashion. A recent study on greenhouse gas emissions over the lifetime of a commercial building found that 30% of total emissions are associated with furniture, which I think is an astonishing figure. But this is actually due to the amount of replacement of furniture over the lifetime of a commercial building, and of course, because of all of the supply chain impacts of extraction, manufacturing, and distributing that furniture. And these goods also come at a price tag. Government procurement for ICT and office equipment is over 400 million per year. So through ReUse, we're able to keep the value of this investment in the sector for longer or in the wider community for longer, and also able to have a significant impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And we have two small just case studies from the UK, or one because they're two similar ones, from public sector bodies with around 300 employees. We're able to save £50,000 per year and avoid 14 tonnes of carbon from implementing a reuse scheme. Our network, as I said, is made up of social enterprises in reuse, repair, and recycling, and you can see there's 31 members here. And in 2018, they reused 23,000 tonnes of goods, and this amounts to about 1% of the total waste arising. So this shows really the reuse sector in Ireland is still growing and has some way to go. We need more research like this. We need infrastructure, systems, and financial supports that will help make it easier to pass on bulky goods. Those members who play a key role in facilitating bulky good reuse are highlighted here in red, and that includes everything from bicycle and furniture repair and reuse through to mattress recyclers. So within this project, what we wanted to do is look at how we can make bulky item reuse as cost effective and convenient, especially, as possible for the public sector. And this included looking at things like how to overcome barriers. We wanted to identify some useful exchange platforms that they could use and look at how service models like this could be made both affordable and financially viable. Within the scope of the project were bulky goods such as office furniture, as well as fixtures and fittings, as well as office consumables, equipment from labs or hospitals, and electrical equipment that often accompany clearances. But I should say that we didn't look into great detail at the health and safety considerations for things like lab and medical equipment. A reuse scheme or service model is a system that involves both physical and administrative steps that helps get an unwanted bulky item from the donor right through to the end user or the claimant. And those claimants include, for example, other public sector bodies or the third sector organizations such as charities, social enterprises, schools, and not-for-profits, as you can see here. And the scheme involves everything from assigning resources, staff resources, getting details about the items, checking for quality, connecting to a network of claimants, how you're going to pass on the goods, and looking at exchange platforms, turnaround times, vacancy dates, and many other things that I'll describe as we go through this talk. So we began the project with some background research, of course, and quite a lot of stakeholder engagement. And we did that through interviews, workshops in Dublin, Cork, and Sligo, and a quantitative survey. Through the workshops, we actually identified 4 existing reuse schemes that different public bodies were already implementing, and that included UCD with a commercial platform, Warpit, and 3 internal schemes that have been set up at Cork University Hospital, the Health Service Executive, and the OPW. And actually, the OPW has quite a sophisticated internal reuse scheme involving 2 large warehouses and a refurbishment workshop. And this is really set up for government departments only. Through the survey, what we found is that 1/3 of those surveyed conducted more than 5 bulky clear-outs in the past year, and a fifth had disposed of over 200 items, so quite a lot of furniture was being discarded, and the most popular disposal method was skip. The overwhelming majority of those responding to the survey were interested in a reuse platform, but we do acknowledge, of course, a level of bias because those who responded were already at some level of interest. And there was more interest in using a platform or a reuse scheme to pass on goods than to source goods, which is something we expected, and that may actually grow as I mentioned earlier. Through COVID, we're seeing more clearances as people reimagine the workspace and less interest in sourcing secondhand. One area we wanted to understand, and you can see in the bottom right-hand side, is if there's any limitation on who the furniture could be passed on to. But only 10% of public bodies found it was extremely important for the goods to be kept within the public sector, for the value to be retained within the public sector, and more actually felt that it was important to donate items to charity, and that's what you can see in the graph there on the bottom right-hand side. So through the workshops, we identified a number of barriers, and the survey helped rank those barriers. And we found that essentially there were 4 top barriers for reuse schemes, including a lack of storage space, followed by liability concerns, a lack of internal resources, and finally, turnaround times. So to begin with storage issues, about 1/3 of the respondents to our survey expressed concerns about storage, and this is a really common issue for bulky goods reuse. We looked at all different storage options, including using on-site shipping containers during clearances or looking at secondhand furniture suppliers that offer storage as a service. But essentially, of course, the cost of storage depends on the amount of time you need it for and the number of goods that are being stored. In general, what we found is that these options are likely to negate any cost savings from waste management. We also found storage comes with new challenges. For example, goods can get damaged in storage, or you need an inventory to manage the goods in storage. Otherwise, it's really easy actually to forget what's there. So to overcome this, particularly in the early stages, what we recommended is that organizations focus more on turnaround times, and I'll go on to that in a second. And to begin a reuse scheme without being overly concerned about storage, and only to look at storage and requirements for storage if there's a real demand for it and costs and other challenges actually stack up. So by turnaround times, what we mean is the number of days for a donated item to find a new home. And this is often dictated by what's called a vacancy date, which is the last date by which you need the good to be moved, or at which time the item is sent to waste. So over half of our survey respondents indicated they needed a turnaround time of between 1 week and 3 weeks, which is relatively short for a process like this. However, it is possible to extend or overcome this challenge by internal processes, staff training, and access to a wide network of claimants. For internal processes, it's important that a reuse scheme starts as early as possible. It could be triggered even, for example, by the tender process for the replacement goods. By staff training, this can really help facilitate awareness, and particularly around the benefits of reuse, and just to get that engagement from staff as both donors and claimants, as well as addressing practical elements like how they should check for the quality of goods that can be reused. And thirdly, in terms of a network of claimants, as I'll discuss in the later part of this presentation, it's really important to get as wide a network of claimants as possible. And this is really built up over time or accessed through existing networks or existing exchange platforms. It's also important, particularly at an early stage of putting in place a reuse scheme, to accept that some amount of goods is likely to remain unclaimed by the vacancy date, depending on the service model used. And these goods are likely to go to waste, but it shouldn't be a deterrent to getting any reuse activity off the ground. As we would say, it's about baby steps. In terms of liability, the issue of ownership is unclear and it can create concerns about legal liability. We found this could be addressed by what's called a transfer of ownership form. And one of these was developed for the PrEP system, which is a free to access public sector exchange platform. And there's something similar for the commercial exchange platform, Warpit, which I'll talk about in a minute. An example of that PrEP transfer of ownership form is available on request from CRNI, and I'll share our contact details at the end. In this case, it's also useful for the users of the system to have their own legal teams assess the form and edit it as they need to. We also sought legal advice from Arthur Cox, which suggested that liability concerns involving the donation and reuse of office furniture should be low risk. In terms of resources, which was another one of the barriers identified, I will go through a number of different approaches or service models that involve different levels of investment, different levels of resource commitment from organizations. But it's important to share, I guess, more case studies that show the cost savings that can be made, including, for example, savings on waste and, of course, savings on procurement. And these can offset the cost of putting in place a reuse scheme, for example, the internal resource commitment and any fees for an exchange platform. In one example, an organization with a reuse scheme was able to save €30,000 on procurement of furniture through internal reuse. Other barriers that came up through the workshops and some of the surveys included a lack of awareness about what happens to bulky items at the end of use, and about the value and the benefits of reuse, and included a lack of incentive for organizations to engage in reuse practices, a perception that it will involve additional hassle, and the cost and availability of transport. And some of these are also addressed in our proposals at the end. So initially, at the start of the project, we started to look at what were free to use, publicly funded exchange systems, SMILE Resource Exchange and PrEP, which was, as I mentioned earlier, the public sector exchange platform, to support our service model. These were also the only exchange platforms available in Ireland at the time. However, throughout the project, we had to really adapt our approach because in 2018, SMILE was discontinued, and in 2019, the commercial platform called Warpit, which you can see on the bottom of the screen there, began to focus on the Irish market. So in response to this, what we did is looked at two detailed business models that didn't rely on public funding and instead relied on donor organizations to pay subscription fees. And these included a national reuse platform and tailored approaches. For the national platform, what we wanted to do is use as much as possible the two platforms, SMILE and PrEP, or what was possible to recover from those, and combine them. And through cost modeling, what we found, it would cost about €20,000 in grant funding for setup costs to revive, in particular, PrEP and make it fit for purpose. And it would also require the subscription of at least 60% of all local authorities, hospitals and universities upfront, as well as an ongoing annual commitment in order to cover the operational costs to run both the platform and to have a person available to manage and service it. So this was felt to be unrealistic for a number of reasons. First of all, that's a very, very high initial engagement level from public sector, and we weren't certain of the level of interest in it. We also couldn't identify a natural home for the platform, as in who would operate it. And thirdly, it would actually end up duplicating what was already available from Warpit in the Irish market, the commercial platform. And it may be difficult to justify grant investment in something that will be competing with a commercial option. So we then looked at how we could provide some tailored service model options. And this approach involved public sector bodies designing and implementing systems that give them the maximum amount of flexibility to try out reuse schemes, invest in commercial platforms, or use an internal manual system. And we felt overall that this approach would ultimately be more successful. I should note that for both the national platform and a tailored service model involving commercial platforms, that the overall fees for use of these platforms were higher than what most survey participants said they were willing to pay, which was about €500 per year. And I think what this shows is there's not enough awareness about the potential benefits and savings associated with these schemes, and that's something that we need to really publicize and share. So the first of the tailored models, and we identified 4 different approaches that I'll go through now. The first one was an internal reuse scheme within a single organization. And here the organization picks a suitable way to advertise, manage, and report their unwanted items. This could be either through an internal manual system or an online commercial exchange, for example. And a manual system simply means through emails or existing contact networks. Staff members are invited to upload or claim the unwanted items, but some resources are ultimately going to be needed to internally manage and oversee the unwanted items, make sure that owners and claimants are connected, arrange training, compile metric reports, and so on. A process is also needed to manage the items that aren't claimed before the vacancy date or the last date by which they need to be moved. As you can see on the advantages side, this kind of system is very quick to implement. It can come at low cost, and it can really help limit liability and storage issues because everything is kept internally. However, on the disadvantages side, the small network of claimants can really limit how many items might be claimed and may create delays. And also, internal resources are needed to set up and manage the entire scheme. So another approach is to broaden this same internal network to involve a wider network, including the third sector. In this case, the unwanted items that aren't claimed after a fixed period of time are donated to third sector, such as schools and charities. For this, we did recommend an online commercial system because it would help facilitate communication with external partners. And as you can see, some additional coordination is required to manage the partners on the disadvantages side, and there's an additional cost to having a commercial platform. But on the advantages side, the number of claimants, of course, increases considerably, and this really helps the chances of the exchange particularly happening on time. Another important advantage too is that the third sector claimants often provide and pay for their own transport. And of course, it does provide an important social impact by providing donations to charities and third sector. As I've mentioned a few times, reuse, of course, works better when there is a wide network of claimants. And in particularly, if this can be concentrated within a geographical area, you get a greater density of donors and claimants in what we would call a cluster. So this third option looks at establishing a cluster of organizations that all contribute to a single network via an exchange platform. So obviously this widens the network of claimants, it reduces transport, importantly, and it helps engagement, and particularly with momentum, as you can see on the advantages side, because you then get and create some peer-to-peer support with internal reuse champions. However, on the disadvantages side, it does, of course, require one single organization to really coordinate and give momentum to the cluster and to champion it. And it still needs management buy-in from all of those participating organizations and commitment of resources from them to both staff and help funds to support a commercial platform and to actively participate in it. Finally, we included a model for organizations who just want to try out a reuse scheme for one-off projects without any significant investment. For example, if they're doing a refurbishment project. So in this option, a champion is needed to get buy-in for a reuse scheme internally. Ideally, a reuse scheme would be written into, for example, tender documents for refurbishment. And that person also has to advertise unwanted items and all the other tasks, very similar to the first option that we presented on setting up a reuse scheme internally. However, in this option, it's possible just to look at, for example, one floor or one room if resources are limited. And as it's a one-off scheme, there's no investment in an exchange platform. That's on the advantages side. But of course, the network of claimants would be considerably more limited. Also, on the disadvantages side, it doesn't involve the wider organization. There may be less buy-in or cultural change, for example, so it would have less internal impact. However, on the benefit side, it really could help stimulate and be used as a basis for establishing a permanent reuse scheme. For these projects, as well as internal refurbishment projects, it could be worth considering looking at opportunities to refurbish some of the existing furniture for internal reuse. For example, to reupholster some of the fabric covered material furniture. So a nice opportunity to do both the exchange side and also to keep goods internally. For all four approaches, we identified some important steps to implementing and setting in place a reuse scheme. And some of these are really common to so many change projects across organizations. The first one being, of course, the importance of getting upper management buy-in as a first step. Because what this does is it demonstrates it is a priority, it helps raise awareness across the organization, and of course, it all makes those all-important resources available to the scheme. It's also important to get buy-in from other departments because so many departments can be involved in a scheme like this, from procurement to facilities, training, marketing, and IT teams, for example. Thirdly, it's important to discuss and set your internal reuse process. For example, looking at whether you want to use a manual or commercial exchange platform, what items will be reused, what are the turnaround time requirements, what happens to things that aren't claimed in time, who can claim the items, will they stay internal or go external to third parties, for example, cataloging and advertising items, who's responsible for all of these things, and how does it integrate with existing waste management policies. So all of this would form your internal reuse process. In terms of number 4, well, we've discussed that it's not recommended to put in place storage in the early stages of a reuse scheme. It may become a priority, particularly if there's high value goods or equipment, and that should be looked at on a case-by-case basis. In terms of transport, of course, you need to have that physical exchange of goods, and that has to be arranged and agreed for who will be responsible for it, for covering transport costs and logistics. And as I mentioned, if third sector is involved, often, for example, charities will provide collections free of charge. It's valuable to connect schemes like this into the purchasing system. Because as I mentioned, one of the great cost savings can actually be that the furniture is recirculated and claimed internally and offsets purchasing costs. And finally, it's important to make sure staff are aware of the platform, particularly the benefits of it, and that they know how to engage with it. And this should be communicated as widely as possible through training and updates, particularly, for example, showing how much waste is being diverted from landfill, what are the carbon savings, what are the cost savings. And it's important to get feedback as well from donors and claimants that may be internal or external after a number of months of operation, just to see what could be improved. In terms of project outputs, a lot of these steps that I've mentioned and those 4 reuse schemes that we've recommended are all set out in the how-to guide that you can see on the right-hand side and summarized in our infographic that you can see on the left-hand side. And both of those are available on our website, crni.ie/bulky items reuse. One of the unanticipated benefits of the project was actually that we were able to access furniture clearances that helped supply an important procurement project in Tullamore. And I've talked about procurement a bit. Here's a really good example of how it can work. The National Waste Collection Permitting Office wanted to furnish their offices with 100% upcycled and reused goods. So our network, CRNI, set up a consortium with 2 of our members, the Rediscovery Centre and Back to New, and we provided nearly 100 items for the tender. But we actually ended up working with 10 suppliers altogether, and this included UCD and Henkel, who were both doing large furniture clearances at the time. So through this process, we were able to test some of the reuse schemes and make considerable cost savings to this procurement project. So where to next? One of the key recommendations from the project was actually that we needed some strong policy drivers really to back up and give public sector bodies the incentive to look at and undertake reuse schemes. And we were really pleased to see the Waste Action Plan for a Circular Economy, which is Ireland's new waste plan, include targets for the procurement of used goods, and also to recommend that public sector bodies include reuse policies in their procurement and asset management plans. So this is a really positive step forward, and we think will really underpin more reuse schemes taking place. We also strongly recommended that public sector bodies start small scale, look at paths of clearances and tailored approaches, and that's where I think the 4 tailored options can really help. And finally, we identified a need for more good practice examples, and we are working to try and provide some of those on our website. But we would like to see if we can support any public sector bodies to put in place reuse schemes and create case studies around those. And we'd like to, I suppose, offer our support in that area. We also have an opportunity to collaborate with Warpit, the commercial platform that I mentioned earlier, on a pilot program, and would welcome any feedback or interest in that. You can get in touch with us through the contact details here, our website crni.ie or info@crni.ie, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.